Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. Jessica Fletcher and The Last Morning at number 14. Chapter 1. The House at Chamelibagh. It was the monsoon season in Dhaka, and the air carried that heavy scent of wet earth mixed with the sweetness of flowering trees. I'd come halfway around the world for what was supposed to be a quiet fortnight. A literary conference, some sightseeing, and perhaps a little research for a new novel. The conference had gone splendidly, though I confess I was beginning to tire of panel discussions on the mystery writer's craft. When my old friend Nusrat, a fellow writer and native of Dhaka, invited me to stay at her flat in the Chamelibagh district, I welcomed the change. It was a pleasant neighbourhood, leafy lanes, narrow balconies, brimming with potted plants, and the constant hum of rickshaws on the main road. I'd only been at Nusrat's a day when something unusual caught my attention. That morning, as we sipped tea by her front window, I saw a tall man, later introduced to me as Mr. Alam, pacing in front of the building opposite. He was looking up repeatedly at a particular balcony on the second floor, his expression caught somewhere between worry and confusion. "That's the Rahman flat," Nusrat explained when I asked. "They're a quiet family, Inspector Rahman, his wife Sapna, their daughter and little boy. Nice people." She hesitated before adding, "At least." I thought so, but no one's seen them for days. Now I've lived long enough to know that no one's seen them for days is rarely the prelude to something pleasant. By mid-morning, 2 uniformed constables arrived and joined Mr. Alam outside. It seemed he was a relative, a brother perhaps, and was explaining that repeated knocks on the Rahman's door had gone unanswered. When he'd telephoned, there had been no reply. I told myself it was none of my business. After all, I was only a visitor here, but as I watched them confer, I noticed something else. Even from across the street, with the windows closed, there was a faint, acrid tang in the air. The sort of smell a mystery writer's mind regrettably recognizes. Within the hour, a locksmith had been fetched. I couldn't help it. I slipped downstairs and joined the small crowd forming in the street. Nusrat came too, no doubt as curious as I was. When the door to the Rahman flat finally swung open, the air that escaped was warm, still, and wrong. I could see one of the constables stiffen and the other glanced instinctively toward a closed door at the end of the hall. Mr. Alam called out the family's names, but his voice wavered on the last one. No answer came back. It was at this point I might have turned away, left it to the authorities, but a voice from inside carried clearly into the corridor. "There's something in here, sir. The bathroom." I will never forget the sound Mr. Alam made when he stepped inside and saw for himself. It was not the wail of a man surprised. It was the hollow, broken sound of a man who had already feared the worst. Word spread quickly through the building, far too quickly. Neighbours pressed into the hallway. The watchman, a wiry man with an alert gaze, tried to keep them back. I stood near enough to hear fragments of conversation between the constables, 2 bodies, a man and a woman, signs of violence. The rest of that day passed in a haze of police activity. An inspector from the local station arrived, barking orders in sharp, efficient bursts. Photographers followed, their cameras clicking in grim rhythm. I noticed the watchman again answering questions stiffly. Later, when the officers moved inside, I took the opportunity to approach him. He told me the Rahmans had last been seen 3 days prior. On that day, their elder daughter, Oishi, he said, had left the building with her younger brother and the maid, a slight girl of perhaps 11 or 12. They had bags, he added, frowning. Miss Oishi told me they were going out for a few hours. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't unusual, but the fact that they had not returned clearly troubled him. Did she seem upset? I asked, keeping my voice low. The watchman considered. She avoided my eyes. The little boy looked like he had been crying. The maid kept her head down. It was not much, but in my experience, such small details often prove important. By late afternoon, the bodies had been removed, and the building felt oddly hollow without the constant police movement. Nusrat and I returned to her flat, but my mind kept circling the same questions. Why would the children and the maid leave? If the parents were harmed in their own home, why was there no sign of forced entry? And where, in all of this, was the elder daughter now? The newspapers would no doubt have the facts by morning, but facts alone are rarely the full story. People speak more freely before the official version hardens into print. That evening, I took a slow walk along the lane, pausing near the small tea stall at the corner. The stall owner, eager to talk, told me the Rahmans were respectable, but the girl was difficult. He said it without malice, but with the tone of a man repeating something long understood in the neighbourhood. Always with different friends, he added. Older ones. Sometimes she would not come home until late. By the time I returned to Nusrat's, I had the beginnings of a picture. An upright police inspector, his working wife, a younger son, and an elder daughter who seemed to live on the edges of their authority. It was far too soon to draw conclusions, of course. But as I sat at Nusrat's table, the city's evening call to prayer drifting in from the distance, I couldn't shake the sense that the heart of this case would not be found in police reports or forensic charts. It would be found in the tangle of relationships within that family, in what had been said and what had been left unsaid. And somewhere in that tangle, I was certain, lay the answer to what had happened inside the house at Chamelibagh. Chapter 2. Threads of Silence. The morning after the discovery, the narrow street in Chamelibagh had a subdued air. Dhaka is rarely quiet, but there was a different sort of hush, one born not of peace, but of unease. People spoke in low voices at doorways, glancing toward the Rahman flat, as though afraid it might overhear them. Nusrat had her own work to do that day, so I decided to make myself useful. Though useful, in this case, meant satisfying my growing curiosity. I took a small notebook from my handbag, the kind I often keep for story ideas, and set out across the street. Mr. Alem was already there, standing by the open stairwell, smoking a cigarette with sharp, quick drags. Up close, he looked even more worn than the day before. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with lines around his mouth that suggested both authority and worry in equal measure. I introduced myself politely, explaining that I was a friend of Nusrat's and had heard of his loss. He inclined his head, saying little at first, but I've learned that a gentle prompt at the right moment can open floodgates. They were good people, he said at last, his eyes fixed on the pavement. Strict, yes, but good. Strict, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. He exhaled slowly. Mahafjur, my brother, was a police inspector. Discipline was everything to him. Sapna, my sister-in-law, was the same in her way. They wanted the children to grow up respectable, educated, but he hesitated, his cigarette burning down between his fingers. The girl, Oishi, was difficult. There it was again. That same choice of words the tea seller had used. Difficult. It's a word that can mean anything from stubborn to dangerous, and I've learned never to take it at face value. What do you mean by difficult? I asked gently. He gave a short, humourless laugh. She mixed with the wrong people, stayed out late. Once, she disappeared for a day. My brother. He didn't know what to do with her. I let that settle, then asked, "And the boy?" "Oh, he?" His tone softened. "Good boy, only 8. He saw more than a child should ever see." Before I could ask more, the watchman appeared at the stairwell, wiping his hands on his shirt. I thanked Mr. Allen and took the opportunity to speak with him again. He was less guarded this time, perhaps because I'd shown interest the day before. "Yes, madam," he said when I asked about the last time he'd seen the family. "That morning Miss Oishi came down with her brother and the maid. They had 2 bags. She said they were going out for a few hours." I tilted my head. "Did she seem nervous?" He frowned, thinking. "Not nervous, but she didn't look at me. The little boy had red eyes like he'd been crying. The maid kept her head low." "And that didn't strike you as odd?" I pressed. His shoulders lifted in a slow shrug. "Families have their troubles. I do not ask." That might be true, but I suspected he'd asked himself plenty of questions since then. From there, I walked to the end of the lane where the tea stall stood. The owner, a wiry man with an eager manner, was more than willing to talk. "Yes, madam, they were respected," he said, pouring steaming tea into a small glass. "But the girl, she had friends, older friends. I saw her sometimes with a man, tall, a dancer, I think. Not the sort of company for a police inspector's daughter." The man's eyes darted left and right before he leaned closer. "The night before, there was shouting, not from the street, but from inside." "Shouting?" "Yes." I heard the inspector's voice, angry, the girl's too. Then a door slammed. After that, nothing. By now, my mind was fitting these pieces into a tentative shape. An elder daughter estranged from her parents, possibly mixed up with questionable friends. An argument, then the family vanishes from sight, save for the maid and the boy, spirited away under vague pretenses. Still, I was missing the voice of someone who had been in that flat when events unfolded. That voice belonged to the maid, Sumi. Finding her was not simple. Mr. Allen told me she had been taken to stay with relatives after giving a statement to the police. But he agreed to arrange a meeting that afternoon in the courtyard of a nearby building, away from prying ears. Sumi was small for her age, her dark hair tied back in a neat braid. She stood with her hands clasped, eyes fixed on the ground, answering in soft, halting sentences. "I was sleeping," she said when I asked about that night. "I woke up. I heard noise, like someone moving fast. I looked through the keyhole. Miss Oishi was holding something, shiny." "A knife?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Her lips trembled. "I think so." "Madam, was on the floor, sir, in the bedroom, the little boy, crying." It was difficult to tell how much was clear memory and how much had blurred in shock. But the important thing was that Sumi had seen enough to know the violence had come from inside the family, not from intruders. "Why didn't you tell the police everything straight away?" I asked gently. Her eyes flicked up to mine for the first time. "She told me to say it was 2 men, that they came in the night. She said if I told, they would hurt me." There was fear there still, the kind that doesn't fade in a single day. I made a mental note to speak again with Sumi later, when she might feel safer. As I walked back toward Nusrat's, I realized the case already had the hallmarks of a human tragedy rather than a puzzle of locked doors and alibis. There was discipline, perhaps too much of it. There was rebellion, perhaps too fierce, and somewhere between the two, something had broken beyond repair. The police would find their evidence soon enough. They usually do. But as for understanding the why of it, well, that is rarely found in fingerprints or fibres. That, I thought, would take the patience to listen to what was being said, and more importantly, to what was not. Chapter 3. The Girl in the Interview Room. By the next morning, the story had leapt from whispered speculation to the bold black headlines of the Dhaka newspapers. Inspector and wife found dead, daughter missing. One read in a font large enough to be seen from across a tea stall. Nusrat and I ate a quiet breakfast, each lost in our own thoughts. The article contained few real facts, a reminder that official information was still tightly held. But the omission of the daughter's name struck me as deliberate. Either the police were protecting her identity, or they weren't quite ready to say what they suspected. That afternoon, I decided to pay a polite visit to the local police station. In Cabot Cove, the sight of me at our sheriff's desk is an everyday occurrence. Here, I expected a little more formality. Still, a warm smile and the air of a concerned neighbour can do wonders in gaining entry to a room. The station was a bustle of activity, officers at desks tapping reports into computers, a clerk carrying an armful of case files, the faint smell of tea steeping somewhere nearby. Through an open doorway, I glimpsed a narrow room with a table, 3 chairs, and a uniformed officer speaking to a girl in civilian clothes. It took me a moment to realize that the girl was Oishi. She sat, slouched, arms folded, hair falling loosely around her face. Her eyes were dark, not only from sleeplessness, but from something harder, a defiance I've seen in young people who believe the world has already made up its mind about them. The man questioning her, later introduced as Inspector Rahman, no relation to the family, had a firm but even tone. From where I lingered in the corridor, I could catch only fragments. Said they were alive when you left. Then why did the watchman? And the jewellery, Oishi, where is it? Her answers came low, sometimes mumbled, and more than once she pushed her chair back as if to end the conversation altogether. Once I heard her say quite clearly, "It wasn't me. 2 men came. Ronnie knows." Ronnie. That was a name I hadn't heard yet, but it landed with weight. I stepped away before my presence in the hallway attracted official notice, finding myself beside a large corkboard covered in missing person notices and bulletins. It's an old habit of mine to scan such things. You never know what threads might connect. But in this case, my attention was quickly drawn back to the murmur from the interview room. Her tone had changed, less defiant now, more uncertain. "I don't remember. Maybe I was asleep." It was the sort of shift in story that police notice instantly, but which often has deeper roots than a simple lie. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes confusion, and sometimes it's both. I decided my time was better spent elsewhere, so I left the station and made my way back to Chamelibagh. The watchman was at his post again, leaning on the gate as if nothing in the world could surprise him. When I asked casually whether he'd heard of anyone named Ronnie, his eyes flickered. A small movement, but telling. "Yes," he said after a pause. "Tall man, comes here sometimes, friends with Miss Oishi, not good company." "What makes you say that?" "Different hours, different people. Sometimes they go in taxi, sometimes on foot. She hides when her father is near." I jotted it down in my notebook, drawing a small box around the name Ronnie. In my experience, anyone who hovers at the edge of a family's disapproval often has a role to play in the drama that follows. A little further along the lane, I stopped at the tea stall again. The owner greeted me like an old friend, perhaps because I'd been a better listener than customer the day before. He leaned in confidentially. "Police came this morning. Asked me about the man. Ronnie, I told them, dancer, always laughing, always smoking. Not from here, from another part of the city." "And you've seen him with the girl?" I prompted. "Many times, night, day, doesn't matter. Sometimes she looked happy, sometimes," he shrugged, "like she was angry but still went with him." Back at Nusrat's flat, I spread my notes on the small table by the window. There were now 3 clear lines of inquiry. The family dynamic, strict parents, a rebellious daughter, a younger brother caught in between. The outsider influence, Ronnie, the dancer, who seemed to be a constant in Oishi's recent life. The timeline, the argument overheard the night before, the departure with bags in the morning, the watchman's observation of red eyes and lowered heads. It's tempting, at such a point, to leap ahead to conclusions, but I've learned that when a story seems almost too clear, it's often because some crucial piece is missing. That evening, Nusrat returned home and told me she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that the maid, Sumi, had been moved again. This time under the care of extended family in another part of the city. It was to keep her away from press attention, but it also meant my best first-hand witness was slipping further from reach. Still, the path was beginning to take shape. If I could learn more about Ronnie, where he lived, who he knew, what his relationship with Oishi truly was, the fog might begin to lift. And there was another matter that had been troubling me since my brief glimpse of the interview. The way Oishi's story kept shifting, like a river trying to find the easiest path around the rocks. That kind of movement can mean invention, but it can also mean she was telling fragments of a larger truth she couldn't yet bring herself to admit. I've seen it before. And in such cases, the trick is not to press too hard, too soon. Better to let the person circle the truth at their own pace until they forget where they began, and you can see where they've ended up. Somehow, I knew my next step would be to find this Ronnie. Because whether he was the spark that lit the fire, or merely someone who danced in its glow, his shadow was all over the house at Chamelibagh. Chapter 4, The Man Who Danced in Shadows. In most small towns, and I dare say Dhaka's neighbourhoods are small towns in their own way, there are always 2 or 3 people who know everybody's business. The trick is finding the right one. By mid-morning, I was back at the tea stall in Chamelibagh, not for the tea, which was excellent, I admit, but for the stream of passers-by who stopped for a quick glass and a scrap of conversation. It was here I met Karim, a wiry man with a trimmed beard, and the look of someone who had spent his life half in the open street, half in the quiet corners, where news is traded like coins. When I asked, as casually as possible, about dance clubs in the city, Karim's eyes narrowed just a little. "Looking for music, madam?" he asked, his tone carrying more weight than the words. "Something like that," I replied, smiling. "I'm curious about a dancer named Ronnie." The name had its intended effect. Karim leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Tall fellow, good-looking in a careless way. He works some nights at the Lotus Club, some at the Star Pavilion. Not regular anywhere. Too many friends, too many debts." I thanked him, making a mental note. The Lotus Club and Star Pavilion, both names I could give to Nusrat's nephew, who had kindly offered to drive me wherever I needed. That evening, we set out for the Lotus Club. It was a low building tucked between 2 newer shops, its sign glowing faintly against the damp night air. Inside, the lighting was dim, the music a heavy pulse that seemed to make the walls breathe. Dancers moved across a small stage, some graceful, others simply loud in their energy. I asked a waiter about Ronnie and received a wary look. "He's not here tonight. Try Star Pavilion," he murmured, then moved on before I could press. The Star Pavilion was livelier, its floor crowded, the air scented with clove cigarettes and cheap perfume. I spotted him almost immediately. A tall young man in a pale shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, laughing with a group near the back. Even from a distance, I could see why he drew attention. His movements had the ease of someone always aware of being watched. I waited until he drifted away from the group, then approached. "Mr. Ronnie?" I asked. He looked at me with the faint wariness of someone mentally sorting whether they knew you, owed you, or should avoid you entirely. Yes? My name's Jessica Fletcher. I'm visiting from America, staying with a friend in Chamelibagh. At the mention of the neighbourhood, his expression tightened. Barely, but enough for me to notice. I understand you were acquainted with a young woman named Oishi Rahman, I continued, keeping my tone friendly. I know many people, he said with a shrug, but his eyes flickered sideways, checking the room. Why? I was nearby when the incident happened, I said. I couldn't help but be curious. He gave a half smile, the sort that tries to disarm without actually answering. Curiosity can be dangerous. Only if one has something to hide, I replied lightly. For a moment he studied me, weighing whether to walk away. Then, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps because he underestimated me, he stayed. She came here sometimes, he said at last. She didn't like her parents telling her what to do. I listened, that's all. And you never encouraged her to leave home? I asked. He snorted. She didn't need encouragement. She hated that flat, said it was a prison. I let that sit for a moment before asking, and the jewellery? The police say some things are missing. Now he looked directly at me. If something's missing, maybe she took it, not me. He started to turn away, then paused. If you want to know about that family, talk to the maid. She saw more than anyone. It was a neat deflection, and one that confirmed he knew very well what had happened in Chamelibagh. But whether he was an accomplice, a confidant, or just an opportunist still remained to be seen. Back at Nusrat's, I considered what I had learned. Ronnie was not the sort to carry out violence himself, at least not the sort of violence found in the Rahman flat. But he was the sort who might help someone cover it up, or profit from it afterwards. The next day, I returned to Mr. Alam with a question. Had he ever met Ronnie? Yes, he said grimly. Once. My brother brought him to the flat to warn him to stay away. I was there. It did not go well. Words were said. Oishi sided with him, not with her father. That, I thought, was telling. In family disputes, loyalty is often the clearest line to follow. And if Oishi had chosen Ronnie's side openly, it was no small fracture. It was a break. That evening, the watchman confirmed another detail. The morning the girl left with the maid and her brother, she had been carrying 2 bags. One, he said, was heavy enough to make her pause on the stairs. Heavy, like cash, jewellery, or something far worse. The more I listened, the more one truth became clear. Whatever had happened in that flat, it was not a crime of impulse. It had been building for some time, fed by resentment, outside influence, and, but if I read Ronnie's manner correctly, the dangerous encouragement of someone who enjoyed stirring trouble without facing the consequences himself. But the police still didn't have her statement pinned down. And until they did, the rest of us were left with questions. And with the unsettling knowledge that somewhere in the spaces between what Oishi said and what she left out, the truth was waiting. Chapter 5. A Conversation in Fragments. When I suggested to Nusrat that I might like to speak with Oishi directly, she looked at me the way one might look at a person proposing to walk into a lion's den. She's not easy to talk to, Jessica, she warned. The police say she changes her story every time they ask. One day she blames strangers, the next she says she remembers nothing. That, I said, is precisely why I'd like to hear her for myself. Through a combination of Nusrat's connections and Mr. Alam's reluctant blessing, I was granted a short, supervised visit at the station. It was late afternoon when I was shown into a narrow interview room, the ceiling fan turning lazily above. Oishi was already there, slouched in her chair, her hair loose and slightly unkempt. She looked younger than I'd expected, and yet there was something in her eyes, a guardedness, an old wariness that didn't belong to a 19-year-old. The officer on duty made the introduction and then stepped back, keeping within earshot. I offered her a polite smile. "Hello, Oishi. My name is Jessica Fletcher. I'm a friend of Nusrat's, and I was in your neighbourhood when everything happened." Her eyes flickered briefly to mine, then away. "Everyone was in my neighbourhood," she said flatly. "Everyone has something to say." "I'd like to hear it from you," I replied, my tone even. "If you're willing." For a long moment she said nothing, tracing a fingertip along the edge of the table. Then with a small shrug she began. "I left the house that morning with my brother and Sumi. We were going to get some air. My parents were fine when I left." "That was the morning the watchman saw you with 2 bags, I prompted gently. Her gaze sharpened slightly. "One was clothes, the other things I needed." "Jewelry?" She gave the faintest of smiles. Not an admission, but not a denial either. "It was mine to take," she murmured. "One day they'd have given it to me anyway." "And where did you go after leaving the building?" I asked. She leaned back, folding her arms. "Here, there, different places. I didn't keep track. Ronnie helped." I let the name hang in the air between us, watching for a reaction. A slight tightening around her mouth told me I had struck a chord. "He says he only listened to you," I said. "That he never encouraged you to leave home." Her laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Ronnie doesn't encourage, he just agrees. It's easier for him, but he understands me." "And your parents didn't?" This time she didn't answer at all. She looked down at her hands, the nails bitten to the quick. I decided to shift the angle. "Tell me about the night before you left." Her shoulders tensed. "We argued. They took my phone, said I couldn't see my friends anymore, said I was—" She stopped herself abruptly. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," I said softly, "because I think that argument has a great deal to do with what happened next." She looked at me for the first time, really looked, as though weighing whether I was simply another adult waiting to scold her, or someone who might understand. "They never listened," she said finally. "Not once. It was always about what I did wrong, about who I was with, about control." I didn't push her further in that moment. When someone offers even a sliver of truth, I've found it's best to accept it, without immediately demanding the whole. Instead, I asked about her brother. "Oh, she said, and for the first time her tone softened. "He's just a kid. He didn't deserve any of it." "He saw a great deal, didn't he?" Her eyes clouded. "He shouldn't have been there. I put him in the bathroom so he wouldn't—" She broke off again, her jaw tightening. It was a slip, but a telling one. She had placed him somewhere for some reason. Not the action of someone simply leaving home while her parents were fine. Before I could press, the officer at the door announced our time was up. I stood, gathering my notebook, though I hadn't written a word. I never do, not when it might close someone off. As I left, Oishi's voice followed me, softer now. "They think they know, but they don't know me, not really." Back in the humid air outside the station, I turned the conversation over in my mind. She had offered fragments, not a confession, not even a consistent account, but enough to sketch the outline of something deliberate. There were still gaps large enough to drive a lorry through, but I had learned 3 important things. She had taken items from the flat, possibly jewelry, possibly more. She had been with Ronnie after leaving, and his role was not merely that of a bystander. She had placed her brother in another room during a crucial moment, which implied she knew something was about to happen that he shouldn't see. That evening, Nusrat made tea while I arranged my notes in a tidy line across the table. "I don't suppose you're any closer to knowing what happened?" she asked. "I think," I said, "I'm closer to knowing why, and that in the end will lead us to what happened." There was still much to learn, from Ronnie, from the maid, and perhaps even from the boy himself, though that would require more care than any other step. But as I sat there with the ceiling fan stirring the warm air, I knew one thing for certain. The truth of the house at Chamelibagh was no longer buried in police files. It was sitting just beneath the surface, in the minds of those who had lived it. And I intended to bring it into the light. Chapter 6. The Maid's Quiet Truth. It took a few days and a favour from one of Nusrat's acquaintances to arrange another meeting with Sumi. By then she had been moved to stay with an aunt in a quieter part of Dhaka, far from the reporters who had begun sniffing around the case. The city seemed to sigh into a slower rhythm there. The streets were narrower, the shop signs faded, the scent of coriander and frying onions drifting from open kitchens. Sumi's aunt received me politely, though with the protective air of someone guarding a child who'd seen too much. "She has nightmares," she said in Bengali, which Nusrat translated. "She wakes crying. Please, madam, don't make her relive everything." "I'll be gentle," I promised. We found Sumi in the courtyard, sitting cross-legged with a piece of chalk, drawing shapes on the cracked concrete. She looked up at me with the same shy wariness I'd seen before, but there was also something different. A small relief, perhaps, in being away from the building where it all happened. I sat beside her, letting a few moments pass before speaking. "You told me before that you saw something through the keyhole," I began softly. "Do you remember?" She nodded. "Miss Oishe, she had the knife. Madame was on the floor." "Was she still moving?" Sumi's brow furrowed as she tried to recall. "She made a sound, like..." She hesitated, pressing a hand to her own throat, like she was trying to call someone. "And your sir? Inspector Rahman?" "He was in the bedroom. I didn't see him, but I heard him coughing. Then nothing." It wasn't a full picture, but it filled in more than the police reports I'd managed to glimpse, and it also confirmed that the violence had taken place while the children and Sumi were still in the flat, a detail that made the story of leaving them alive crumble further. I asked gently, "What happened to the little boy?" Her eyes lowered. "He came out when Madame made the sound. He cried." She told him to run, but Miss Oishi pushed him toward the bathroom. She locked it. The image was stark and telling. Whatever else could be said of her, Oishi had wanted her brother away from the scene before she continued. Sumi's voice dropped further. "After, she told me to clean. There was blood. On the floor. On the bed. She said if I told anyone, Ronnie's friends would find me." "Had you met Ronnie before?" I asked. She shook her head. "Only heard her talk about him. She said he would help her." "How?" "She didn't say, just that he would come. That was the opening I needed." "Did he come?" Sumi glanced toward her aunt's doorway before answering. "Yes, later. When the little boy was asleep, he came with another man. They went into Madame and Sir's room. They took things." "What things?" "Bags, small boxes. They didn't let me see everything, but they took the knife." This was new and crucial. If Ronnie had returned after the killings, it meant he was far more involved than he'd admitted at the Star Pavilion. Helping someone after a crime is still helping. And in my experience, it often reveals far more about the relationship between accomplice and instigator. I thanked Sumi and let the subject rest, turning instead to gentler conversation about her aunt's home, her school, the courtyard where she played. There's only so much a child can revisit before it does more harm than good. Back in Nusrat's car, I relayed the conversation in low tones. She saw him there, I said, afterwards, taking the knife. That's not someone who just listened to her troubles. Nusrat nodded grimly. The police will be interested in that. But I wasn't entirely sure the police would hear it. Children's testimony can be fragile, easily dismissed, easily twisted under pressure. If Ronnie had friends in certain places, it might never see daylight unless handled carefully. That evening, I made a point of visiting the tea stall again. It had become my little observation post, and sure enough, it paid off. A man I hadn't seen before stopped for tea, and Karim, my informant from earlier, greeted him warmly. When the newcomer left, Karim leaned toward me. That man works at the Star Pavilion. He says Ronnie hasn't been there in days. Maybe he's lying low. Or maybe, I suggested, he's found a way to be somewhere no one's looking for him. That night, I spread my notes out on the table at Nusrat's once more. The timeline was tightening. The argument on the night before the murders. The parents seen alive only hours before their bodies were discovered. The departure with the maid and younger brother, bags in hand. Violence witnessed by Sumi through the keyhole. Ronnie's arrival after the fact, removing items, including the murder weapon. Chapter 7. Cracks in the dancer's smile. Finding Ronnie again was not a matter of wandering into a club and asking for him. By now, he would have heard that the police were circling closer, and men like Ronnie have a knack for slipping through narrow gaps when trouble comes knocking. So I changed my approach. Instead of looking for him where he performed, I asked Karim, my tea stall informant, where Ronnie stayed when he wasn't on stage. Karim tapped the side of his nose, as if weighing whether I was trustworthy enough for such information, then leaned in. He keeps a room above the old electronics shop on Chamelibagh Road, no sign outside. He likes it quiet there. That evening, Nusrat's nephew drove me to Chamelibagh Road. It was a narrow, dimly lit stretch, the shop fronts shuttered for the night, their corrugated metal reflecting the pale glow of street lamps. Above one, a rusted balcony jutted out, a single strip of light showing from a curtained window. I climbed the narrow stairs, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. When I knocked, there was a pause, the faint scrape of a chair, and then the door opened just enough for one wary eye to appear. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Ronnie said, his voice a mixture of surprise and irritation. "You have a habit of turning up where you're not invited?" "Only when the invitation is implied," I replied, stepping past him before he could think to stop me. The room was sparse, a bed, a chair, and a small table cluttered with cigarette packets and empty glasses. A half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey stood beside a crumpled shirt. Ronnie closed the door slowly, leaning against it. "What do you want?" he asked. "To hear your side of the story before someone else decides it for you," I said. "And before you decide to disappear entirely?" He smirked, but the edge in his eyes betrayed him. "I told you before, I just listened to her, that's all." "Then it's curious," I said, "that the maid saw you in the flat after the killings, carrying bags, taking the knife." The smirk faltered. "She's a child," he said quickly. "Children see things wrong." "She described the knife perfectly," I replied. "She described you too, and the other man with you. That's not a child's mistake. That's memory." Ronnie walked to the table, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and tossed it back without offering me any. "She called me, said she needed help. I didn't ask questions, I just took care of what she wanted gone." "The weapon?" I said. "And the jewellery?" He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. "Why help her?" I asked. "Because you cared for her? Or because there was something in it for you?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. You think I made her do it? No, she didn't need me for that. She hated them already. I just made sure she wasn't caught too quickly. It was a dangerous admission, not quite a confession, but close enough to make any detective's ears prick up. You realize, I said quietly, that helping someone after a murder is still a crime. He shrugged. Maybe. But in this city there are worse crimes that no one cares about. She's just one girl. Her parents, they treated her like a prisoner. And you? I gave her freedom for a while. It was the kind of justification that told me Ronnie saw himself as something between savior and opportunist, and perhaps he'd never decided which. But it also told me something else. He didn't expect to stay free for long. You should tell the police what you told me, I said. If not to help her, then to help yourself. He smirked again, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I'll think about it. Maybe not. Either way, Mrs. Fletcher, stay out of this. You're not from here. You don't know how things work. I stood, heading for the door. You'd be surprised, Ronnie. People are people, wherever you go. And the truth has a way of catching up, even with those who dance around it. Back in the car, Nusrat's nephew glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Did he tell you what you needed? Not everything, I said, but enough to know he was there after the fact, and enough to know he thinks he's still in control. But as we drove back through the winding streets, I couldn't shake the sense that Ronnie's confidence was starting to crack. And once the first crack appears, the rest tends to follow, sometimes faster than anyone expects. Chapter 8. The house at Chamelibagh, the truth laid bare. 3 days later, I found myself once again in the Rahman building, this time not as an observer peering in from the street, but as an invited participant in what the police here call a final interview. Inspector Rahman, no relation to the family, had agreed to let me sit in, largely because Mr. Alam insisted I had a talent for getting people to talk. The small ground floor meeting room was stark, just a table, 4 chairs, and a ceiling fan that creaked with each slow rotation. Oishi sat on one side, her arms folded, eyes darting toward the window, as though she might find an escape route in the narrow courtyard beyond. On the other side sat Inspector Rahman, his pen poised, and Mr. Alam, his face a careful mask. I took the 4th chair, placing my small notebook in front of me. Oishi, I began gently. I've spoken to quite a few people these past days. Your uncle, the watchman, Sumi, even Roni. At the last name, her eyes flickered. They've all told me parts of a story, I continued. Not the same parts and not in the same order. But when you put them together, they form a picture. And it's that picture I'd like you to hear. She shifted in her seat, but said nothing. It began, I said, with an argument. You felt your parents were controlling you, taking your phone, cutting you off from friends. That night, things were said that couldn't easily be taken back. The next day, you decided to leave with your brother and Sumi, but you didn't leave your parents as you found them. She looked at me sharply, but I went on. Sumi saw you through the keyhole, your mother on the floor, your father coughing in the bedroom. She saw you push your brother into the bathroom to keep him from seeing more. That's not something a stranger would do, Oishi. That's the act of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen. Mr. Alam's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Afterwards, I said, you told Sumi to clean the blood, and you called Ronnie. He arrived with another man. They took jewelry, cash, and the knife. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Ronnie admits he was there, I added. He says you hated your parents already. He says he only helped afterwards, but the truth is, he helped you feel you could go through with it. He made you believe there was a way out. and that he'd be there to cover your tracks. Oishi looked away, her fingers tightening around her arms. I'm not here to judge your anger, I said, quietly. But I am here to tell you that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. You'd thought about it. You'd bought the sedatives. You'd planned when to give them to your parents. And in doing so, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. There was a long silence, broken only by the slow creak of the fan. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost flat. They never listened, not once. It was always about what I did wrong, about control. I just wanted it to stop. I believe you, I said. But there are other ways to make things stop. Other ways to leave. Taking their lives didn't free you, Oishi. It only bound you to them forever, in the worst way. For a moment, her face softened, and I thought perhaps she might say more. But then the mask slid back into place and she simply leaned back in her chair, her gaze unreadable. The inspector cleared his throat and began asking his formal questions, but I knew the heart of the matter had already been laid bare. She might never admit each step in plain words, but the pattern was there, the resentment, the planning, the act, and the cover-up. Outside, in the fading light, Mr. Alem walked with me to the gate. "Will this help?" he asked quietly. "It will help the truth to be understood," I said. "And sometimes that's the most anyone can do." We stood for a moment, looking up at the balcony, where not so long ago life in the Rahman flat had gone on as usual. Arguments and all. Now it stood empty, the curtains drawn, the rooms silent. As I walked away through the evening streets of Chamelibagh, I thought of the little boy, Ohi, and how his life would carry the shadow of that night long after the headlines faded. And I thought, too, of how easily anger, when fed by the wrong influence, can become something irreversible. People often tell me my mysteries are about clever puzzles, the whodunit and the how, but in truth, they're about people, the fragile threads that connect them, and the way those threads can fray, tangle, or snap. In Chamelibagh, the threads had been pulled too tight for too long, and when they broke, there was no mending them.